Welcome everybody. Harry, thank you so much. Harry Droz is the man behind the magical Zoom board. I don't know what it is, but this is Arts Respond on WNHHLP 103.5 FM New Haven. I'm Lucy Gellman, and I am so happy to be back on this muggy, kind of gross, kind of gray Friday with three of my favorite humans and three, I don't know if we can say the word BADASS on air because of the FCC, but three of my favorite that word women in New Haven. Luciana McClure is a co-founder of Nasty Women Connecticut. Sarah Fritchey, also a co-founder initially of Nasty Women Connecticut, and a writer and curator based in New Haven. And Ala Ochumare is a first of all, Renaissance woman. Hello. I'm so happy to see these faces too. This is what COVID does to a person. But a co-founder of Black Lives Matter New Haven, who still runs Black Lives Matter New Haven with four other amazing, amazing women, and is joining us from the road because she is getting away for a well-earned vacation, which I'm thrilled about.
Yes.
Today we will be talking about a new anti-bias, anti-racism training that the three of you and Terry Lau, and please tell me if I'm saying that correctly, are leading for creatives in New Haven. So I first heard about this training on social media, I think about 2 weeks ago, although time is very relative. And I just really want to talk about why it's important to have this training now, why creatives need to be part of this conversation, and need to make systemic change perhaps within their own spheres of influence and their own organizations. So let's get right into it. The first question I have for all of you, for listeners who might not be familiar with the term anti-bias, anti-racism, or ABAR, what is ABAR training?
I guess I should probably answer this. So ABAR training is, and I like to call it more like workshops training. I use the word interchangeably, but it's really a space for transformation and restorative practices around how to be an anti-racist and also how to be an anti-bias anti-racist. Meaning you acquire the language around how to be inclusive, how to care about someone else's lived experience, the language that we need politically to make the right decisions, to make the right choices, how to learn how to undo the dehumanization that all of our cultures have faced due to racism and anti-queerness, and anti-womanness and anti-blackness and all the anti-humanness, and how to do it intentionally and inclusive and hopefully intergenerational and multiracial spaces, because we all have a lot of work to do. White folks have a lot of heavy lifting to do, to realize and humanize themselves and undoing their internalized racial superiority. But Black and brown folks and other folks of color have to do the same amount of work around undoing the way we have been dehumanized and othered. And so that shows in a lack of self-worth, just how we move in our community with each other, and how whiteness shows up and even in spaces that are all Black and brown and all queer. We can have a room full of the queerest, Blackest, and brownest amazing people, and anti-Blackness and whiteness will show up and be very pervasive and harmful in that room, just as much as you can have a room full of all white folks who are super queer and white and of different economic backgrounds, and a lot of harm happen in that same room around the same issues and topics and reasons. It's displayed differently in our cultures and and our socioeconomic backgrounds, but it's a lot of healing to do. So it's a space, an A-bar training and an A-bar workshop is a space to begin to heal around how racism and anti-queerness gets deep down, and we embody that even when we're of that lived experience of being a Black queer person.
And I want to, before we go on, I also want to say, because I've heard in the past weeks, especially, I would say I've had this conversation with a number of folks, especially white folks. So people don't always understand the difference between not a racist and anti-racist. Yeah.
Action. The difference between a non-racist, and one word is action, but to be really intentional, it's action and what you're learning. It's action and what you're unlearning. It's action in the spaces that you enter into, the spaces that you choose to no longer enter into. It's action with the gates and privileges that, especially when we're talking about white folks and white identified folks, or the people who have become white, those people, when they hold a gate, or rather they hold a power or a privilege that can affect the lives of many others, they have to be very intentional about who they let in and out that gate. How do they help reparate the injustices that we all see and know are happening? And to be an anti-racist is every day, no matter what your cultural background is, or no matter what your social economic background is to be inclusive of the people who don't have your same lived experience, because they're, due to capitalism, there's not the only major demographic of humans that live in the world that are not overtly affected by racism and anti-queerness and anti-womanness are white cishet men. So if you are not a white man that presents as a white man who is not overly feminine, those people are about the only safe people. And then sometimes if you add in their intersection, they're not safe from capitalism or racism or anti-humanism either. And so if you're not a white man in America, you have so much unlearning and harm that happens to you without even knowing. And then and for white people, there's the privilege that white people have that we call white privilege. And the goal of being an anti-racist is to not take safety and comfort and being believed from white people, is to make sure that all people have safety and comfort and are always believed and listened to and know that they have a self-worth and know that they matter, and that if they say something, that someone won't question them just because of what they look like or who they choose to love.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I think we need about 5 hours, but we have like 45 minutes, and we're gonna do it. So I want to open it up to the group and ask, why did y'all decide that now was a good time to be doing this? Ala, I often come back to when you said white privilege. So one of the best experiences I've had is being in a training with Carrie Ellington, who leads People Against Police Brutality. And she said, never, ever, ever forget that when you say white privilege, what you mean is my whiteness as an inheritance of violence. And that stays with me. And so why now specifically did you decide, okay, we're not going to wait any longer to hold this training, we need to do it right now?
I can answer that. So, I think that the past 8 weeks just, to me, represented an enormous collective racial consciousness awakening among white people that should have happened so many other times just in the past decade, not to mention the past decade plural. Is anyone else having really bad reception with the sound? I'm getting a feedback loop here. Okay, sorry. That's better. That's way better. Yeah, thank you. And in these moments where there is this radical awakening, and we can think about the different factors that have set the context for this stage, being in a national pandemic where people are sheltering in place and staying at home, leading into a moment where injustices are seen, and then there's this sort of moment to respond en masse, partially maybe because people are just sick of being at home and want to get involved. But hell, look what it has led to. This ability for people to take up arms and to move outside and to start practicing understanding their own coming into being into the racialized spaces that are socially constructed. It's such this outpouring of emotion and support and a willingness to go out in the street and protest. Is if we don't take advantage of this moment where there is this much momentum that I think actually is allowing us to bring these questions back to ourselves personally, back to our fields where structural racism is perpetuated, and the thing that really connects us to a sort of industry-driven economy, then we are missing the opportunity of a lifetime to actually make change. And I think in New Haven, I live here and I love living here because the size of our city really makes it feel like government is held accountable to listening to us when we amass together and we come with a set of demands and action points and in peaceful protest exercise our rights to freedom together to say this is what we want for ourselves, for one another. So the sort of timing of this is a need to respond. It would be so irresponsible to not immediately respond. But I think the training in itself is one that is recognized not about a sort of like rhetoric of unity, but as a work that I know that I need to do and that a lot of white people need to do to be actively, as Ala was talking about, anti-racist, which means looking at the self, looking how these set of inherited privileges lie in yourself, exist in yourself, manifest in yourself, play out in the self, sit in the body. So, racism is in our limbic structures. It settles in different forms and ways. It comes out through our gestures and speech, in our body language. So the training is a call, I think, to create a space where the group has agreed, and this is like, I love Ala and the way that Ala is leading this training, because instead of setting a set of rules of engagement, she's like, let's let go of rules and think about how can we define rules as a set of agreements. So the group agreement is a willingness to be vulnerable and honest and open, and to allow these moments where we are exercising ourselves and things are being said that are deeply racist and deeply troubling, to sit in that space, be very uncomfortable, and then as a group talk about them. And we have had one session so far, and the experience that I just described happened in that space. And it is an unusual space to create, because I think at large, New Haven, New England, our country is extremely segregated by racial lines, and that a lot of our interracial relationships are with people that maybe we work with professionally, and that there is a danger around those set of relationships always being beholden to respectability politics, sort of understanding of a professional relationship where there are certain boundaries that you cannot cross or questions that you cannot ask. So this work is involving everyone in that group to be vulnerable and to be open to exercising language and themselves to ask questions of one another of how did we get here? How do we undo this? And what is the work that we consistently need to be doing, like brushing our teeth every single day to be anti-racist? I mean, because this is a marathon and a self-marathon, as much as I would say this, we're running 2 marathons. The other one is for the fields that we're coming from, right, professionally. And we can, I'm sure there's 3 marathons that we can also address when we talk about our home structures and our home lives, right? Schooling, housing, all the parts of how we are engaging as civilians in a shared lived space. But so this training is like 4 days of committing to looking at yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I before we go on, I want to make sure that Lucy McClure, if you want to jump in, you can.
Oh, I didn't want to jump in. I was like listening to everybody, and thank you. But I mean, I think what I can add to what both Ala and Sarah was saying, that I almost want to think about was what they're both saying about, the action part of it, of the being an anti-racist, and to me, entering this space and being a collaborator, participant, and thinking about the art element, and thinking about why creativity is such an important part of that, but also as we're thinking about creative practice, creative expression, and being part of this community, this creative community, and understanding how oppressive and how racist it is in so many layers that we are not even aware. And I've even have daily learning to do that work and to understand and see when is the time that I'm willing to take the action. And the action means not only being anti-racist, but also honoring myself and what's been done to me by being part of that system, and not realizing how it has damaged me, but also what can I do now by being, in collaboration with both Ala, Sarah, and Terry. And it is, I think it's one of the things about being together and being listening to Ala speak and asking certain questions that I personally never thought about, that it makes me understand even my own identity. As I think one thing that Ala has mentioned to us at one point during the training is like, being biracial and understanding what it even means being biracial, and not even being aware of that, and how do we come into terms with our own identity through that process, and how that comes through our work as creatives, the stories that we're telling, the ways that we are inviting others to understand our own stories and our own work.
Yeah, well, that gets me into my next question. I feel like in the last probably 3 to 4 weeks, I've received approximately 256 solidarity statements from arts organizations around New Haven and across the country. I would say only 2 of them that I've gotten have mentioned the words white supremacy. Several of them have not addressed anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism by name. And very few of them have talked about the intersections of discrimination at which many folks in this country live. And so I want to specifically pivot to the fact that this is for creatives and talk about how white supremacy is showing up in the creative sector. And this is not just a New Haven thing. This is a countrywide thing, but I've seen it so much in New Haven. And I'm really glad that earlier Ala mentioned also anti-queerness, because I think that in many ways homophobia is tied to white supremacy, but also big time, understatement of the year, perhaps. But not only is it tied to white supremacy and is it an outgrowth of that, but it is, if you look at just the layers of discrimination that some folks are facing in this country, it is deeply traumatic. It is traumatic to be a body moving through this world for many people. And so I'm wondering if we can talk specifically about how this is showing up in the creative sector in New Haven, and the change that all of you, and of course Terry, are hoping to affect through this?
I mean, I would start by saying that museums by designs are places of colonizing other cultures,
Yes.
collecting them, and then contextualizing them around the voice of whoever the person in control is, who historically and within our own institutions are majority white European colonizer settlers. So, you know, the problems that I see from the perspective of just someone living and enjoying all of the many cultural resources that New Haven offers for free through its major institutions and smaller nonprofit organizations, is this desire to produce a solidarity statement that is being responsive of the moment, maybe capitalizing and exploiting the work in the collection that can talk about the powers of colonization while keeping intact leadership in roles where they are not actually trained in the language of decolonizing their institution or their collection. Mm-hmm. And it does not actually help anyone to try and create these sort of quick training sessions where scholars in their field who've been dedicated in writing and talking about objects in a specific way and are academically qualified, so hyper intelligent, that they should be the one doing the work that they're not trained to do. So I see the problem really being in the problem of people believing that history has a linear straight line, that it's writ, that we go into a history museum, we read those labels, and they never need updating. History labels always need updating because history is always written by the people that are in positions of power. So as that shifts and as we go through these awakenings, it's not enough to go through the awakening and to make a really beautiful statement about it on behalf of the institution. The work that actually needs to be done as historians, as humanitarians, as philosophers, as thinkers, as people that are presenting new worldviews is to update that language. And sometimes people that are writing that language need to also be updated. So I think that, sorry.
No, I said exactly what you said, Sarah, and sorry to talk it over and interrupt, but it's what, you know, it's like the narrative control is exactly what you're saying. And then it's just like, you know, but the problem is that white narrative, that colonizing narrative has been so dominant, and people have benefit from it to the point that they don't even question, and that there is no understanding of history, how history has been oppressive, and museums and art museums, you know, galleries, they've been built on that, you know, that's what their names are from. But on top of that, there is also not only the systemic racism, but also the socioeconomic problem that also intersect with that. You know, like this, who gets to own this history, who gets to talk about this history, who gets to experience it, and at the cost of whom, you know, of all the other, you know, of the oppressed voices, you know, of cultures, of traditions that are not being talked about because they're perceived unimportant. So there's not even a space for understanding history, and that is not about changing the history, but it's understanding like how wrong it's been and how it has been one-sided, you know, and how do it's time to just stop that and talk about starting in our communities.
Yeah.
Sorry, go Ala.
I was gonna say, I think that, so how whiteness shows up in every institution, no matter if we're talking about art or education or the criminal justice, like the whole prison industrial complex, we're talking about mental health. We can't leave out the fact that all of these social structures all of these entities were socially created after capitalism and after racism were already, after capitalism and after racism were already established. And so in order to have capitalism, in order to further patriarchy and keep racism existing, you have an othering of folks. You have to have folks who are not viable and aren't people anymore. And so we have a whole system in history. Our entire country is based off of, and the foundations are built by folks who have now historically been shown that we don't matter, that our words don't matter. So while we're also changing language and shifting language, we need to be hiring Black and brown folks. We need to be creating these art museums and the Met and all of these people who are issuing all these apology letters once all their curators get on Twitter and say these racist gaslighting things that are like, you know, dog whistle politics, so only some folks understand what's happening, but we understand that it denotes the whole historical context of museums. Museums were created here in America to show what colonization has done, the things that have been stolen from cultures, and people in, you know, African countries are still fighting to get their artifacts back from institutions that are multi-million-dollar institutions. So once we start reparating what actually happened in our history and stop moving ahistorically in all contexts, we'll have a better understanding of what's happening. But there needs to be several, not only do we need to change the language and shift the language, we need to look at whose stories are being told and from what perspective, and who is now doing the historical the linguistics around that. Who is creating these spaces? Who are the curators of art? What schools are we identifying are viable for people to come through with art major degrees? Because if you want to hire Black and brown folks, that means you need to make viable HBCUs and their art history departments. So these museums need to pay back into HBCUs other than Howard and Spelman, the small ones that we don't know about, the first ones, the oldest ones, the ones that are losing accreditation. Turn them into art history schools. Give them these $1 million write-offs that these art museums are doing in order to continue to create their capital. That all comes from off the backs of Black and brown and queer bodies and our labor and our blood. Build that and put that back into the community. There's a large conversation about what does reparations look like. We can't pay $700 million trillion because that's what the government would have to pay Black and brown bodies to reparate truly what happened in this, not only America, but in Britain and Portugal and in Spain, because all those are colonizing countries and were the original colonizers. And the people who came here learned from all of those colonizers and then improved on their colonization. For lack of a better word, because I don't know if it's improvement.
Well, right, Ala, what you're saying, you're right. It's like how about when you talk about hiring Black and brown folks, you're right. It's like representation. You know, you want to talk about like, you know, same goes into education, same go into schools. Here you want people to like be teaching changing history, changing the way we talk about history and educating about these new narratives and stories that we don't talk about. You know, also it goes into the action, you know, hire people. They're not white folks, just white wealthy people, because that's the history again of the arts, you know.
Right. Put those Black and brown people on the board.
Right. Like, there's none on the board either. And then they're doing these diversity trainings or diversity conversations. And then it's like, they don't even, and they're throwing these words out there like, oh, we're going to do diversity. We're going to be equitable. We're going to put a statement, but it's all empty promises and empty statements that they're not backed by their actions. They're not willing to look into themselves and do their work. And in the middle of this pandemic, you know, Black and brown folks are the first to be expendable. They're the first ones to be laid off of these institutions because all of a sudden, you know, it's like we were just tokenized, you know, but for the grant writing, for showing like that 1-2 people of color in their institutions, but they don't really, the thing is like, there is no actual care or willing to be anti-racist, you know, it's just like the statement, it's just the easy work.
So how do you create, I mean, we're kind of going there already, but how do you, especially in this specific moment where Lucy, you kind of mentioned it, we're dealing with 2 parallel pandemics. We're dealing with COVID-19, in which Black folks are 3 times as likely to die from the disease as their white counterparts. we're also dealing with institutional racism, which was a pandemic long before COVID-19 was on the scene. And there are institutions, so I'm fine using this example because we've written an article about it and it's out there. There are institutions like the Yale University Art Gallery that posted in the wake of George Floyd's state-sanctioned murder. Well, we have Titus Kaphar in our collection, and we have this exhibition on our 4th floor in the study gallery where you have to take like 2 different elevators to get there, and you can't really be there right now anyway, but we have this exhibition of John Wilson's work. They've also said, well, we can't hire anyone because of COVID and because of the economic strain of COVID. And there is an economic strain of the pandemic. I'm not denying that. And you had students who came back and said, hey, this isn't okay. You need to mention the words white supremacy. You need to mention the words anti-Blackness. And, you know, if you're going to do a solidarity statement. So how are creatives supposed to move the needle? And I want to talk about both small organizations, because New Haven does have small grassroots organizations and incubator spaces, some of which I think are like ideologically already there, and some of which really are not. And then New Haven has huge institutions that may or may not be tied to a university with a $30 billion endowment that rhymes with fail.
I mean, I can speak to both of those models if we're talking about these 2 models of scalability. And I think it is so important to always think about scale when we talk about a united we, or community, or communities, or public. So I'm thinking a lot about that word right now. The Yale perspective, the Yale community to put pressure on their leadership to require change. I think if real change needs to happen within Yale University Art Gallery, that a solidarity statement isn't enough, and that there has to be a commitment to an anti-racist, anti-biased work culture. That is a start. The conversation that I hope would be had within Yale University Art Gallery would involve people of color who are cultural workers in the field doing this work already. You know, many people could reach out to past fellows that have worked at Yale University Art Gallery that are people of color to bring them into these conversations about how do we structure this workspace. So I would say Yale is responsible first and foremost from putting pressure within that institution from within, because they're a private corporation. They are a business. They are serving the Yale community first and foremost, you know, just like all the other aspects of Yale are serving the community first and foremost. From a sort of New Haven community perspective, I just go back to things that I've heard Ala say, which is, you know, like the first time I met Ala, she was like, I identify as a creative. And I was just like immediately a little mushball, like, I want to get to know you. I have been in the arts forever, and I have never used that term to self-identify myself, because that's how much I am so rooted in capitalism and like worker structure that I don't even have that language for that affirmation. And it's so powerful to be a creative, because it means that you have the ability to imagine new futures. You can imagine the destruction of your current structures, and you can also imagine all of the simultaneities that we narrow out when we create these sort of major canons and major narratives about what art is and what isn't. So you can understand as a creative that there has been systematically forever all of these simultaneous events of art making that have been left out. And I think for Ala, like knowing that Ala is one of the co-founders of our local Black Lives Matter movement, is someone who is out on the streets making sure that protesters are safe every time Black Lives Matter as a hashtag like lands on a flyer, even if she and her co-founders did or didn't organize that, to be there to lead everyone safely and to say, I don't want to be part of a movement unless, you know, there's art in it, like creativity leads the movement. It just identifies that art is, you know, it's a concept piece. It is it is something that when the message of the movement isn't reaching you, you can put it into art and go to different places. Art can go into action. Art is part of collective action, and it makes collective action joyful, which, thank God, you know, like for song during protest, it moves us and flows us through the street. And thank God for these posters that we have to hold, because it actually forces us to figure out what we want to say. And I think there is a real decision that you have to make when you're writing something down. Are you going to take a sort of like no justice, no peace approach? And even in writing that, I say, good for you. You are finding yourself. You are finding your language and writing it down and affirming it and holding that sign. Or are you thinking of something else that you want to put on that sign and making new language or pushing for different ideas? So, you know, I see the art piece as being really multifarious and really about just bringing like communication into different places through different forms that can be collective and joyful.
Yeah, I think that being a creative allows a certain liberation in a world that, as I'm a creative now as a grown woman, I was always a creative, but I was not always identified or appreciated, or I had to reclaim what creativity looked like and make space for myself. And being a creative allows you to find liberation in a world that is not yet liberated, but is supposed to be free. And freedom and liberation for me are two totally different things. But everyone doesn't have the same definition for words. And that's why it's so important for us to have stuff like this A-bar training for creatives, because a lot of what we talk about is, how did we end up racist? How did we end up this way? You have to understand, we cannot move ahistorically and say, okay, racism is here, we don't want to be anti-racist anymore, and we're going to go to this training and not be anti-racist. Because you can do the training and read 57 books and read Dr. Ibram, and you can read everyone and still be a racist person. You can still be harmful. You can actually learn this language and become more racist and a better skilled racist, more harmful and lascivious, because you take the language and you use it and you manipulate it for what it is, much like the law. And so you have to be in trainings where you create a community with other folks that are creating these same definitions together. So that way you form a network of people who, when you say anti-racism, they know what you're talking about. And that's how you form families. The world and white supremacy and oppression has taken away the communal nature from all of our traditions and ancestral backgrounds. Before people became white, they were Italian. Before people became white, they were French. Before people became white, they were from their country. And folks come from other countries, and they are just now understanding this concept of race. Even though there's anti-blackness in their countries, there's not overt racism like it is here in America, because we modeled it for everyone, and then everyone took it culturally and was like, ooh, we don't like that, we're gonna not take that, we're gonna do this, add this covering, put those folks in ghettos and do those things. Like, the term ghetto is not indicative to Black people, it's indicative to Jewish folks who were pushed into poverty areas. But we in America think a ghetto is where Black folks live. So it's about sharing these spaces and re-socializing ourselves, because we have all been socialized into racism, and it shows up and we embody it in different ways. A lot of the information that I've curtailed and my work is based off a lot of the work of Dr. Joy DeGroy on post-traumatic slave syndrome, and is around racial healing and learning how to do that in multiracial spaces, but also in racial affinity spaces. We create groups for Black people to talk about how white people are problematic and harmful to us, and we need that. White people have that all the time, but now we have Black Lives Matter New Haven and myself and Undoing Racism. We have also created white affinity spaces that are honoring the work of anti-racism and is created and monitored by Black people. So we have a check and balance. This work is constant. It's not you do one training and you're done. You do one training and you read 7 books, and you find another training and you read 12 books, and you go to the actions and you donate the money, and you listen to Black people, and you listen to queer people, and you watch the documentaries, and you go back out to the next action, and you ask questions, and you get checked when your privileges show up. And part of this training that we're doing for creatives and for people, because I have also done the same training for environmentalists. I'm also doing the same training for peer specialists. So I bring anti-racism, anti-bias, and then I create a culture around what's exactly happening in this niche community, and how can we be anti-bias, anti-racist in this niche community. So when you come to this training for creatives, it looks different than if you came to the training for for environmentalists, because we're starting to talk about how racism affects our environmental justice, and how it affects the way communities are set up, and this for creatives. We're talking about, how does this show up in our bodies? How does this now show up in our work? But how does this show up historically in the institutions of art? And how is racism so pervasive? And the Black art, or the art that gets displayed, sometimes you can look at a painting and as a Black person be harmed, and it's in Yale's art museum. But white people identify that as viable art, it's contemporary, it's beautiful. But literally, they just get to have continue their voyeuristic approach at watching our murders and our maiming, and call it art. Picnics are stemmed from, it used to be pick a nigga. You pick a nigga, you put it up on the church bulletin, you hang him after church services, you cut off his appendages, and you take pictures and you smile. That is the historical context around that. That is the historical context around having church in these communities, and the whitewashing of what happened historically, and with lynching, and how those postcards sometimes are displayed as art. How? Why? That's not art. That is further traumatization and trauma porn for Black and brown bodies. And then let's not when we incorporate the intersection of queerness, because there are queer Black people. Although, we're told that we have this super gay agenda, the Black gay agenda is the Black agenda is for liberation for all. But then in queerness, we have to work around racism. That's why I connected, because queer spaces are some of the most harmful spaces for Black queer people. When they're white queer people, white gay men got their rights and left trans and Black women and queer people and non-binary people behind. There's a whole group of how patriarchy and racism has showed up in the queer community. We have to talk about that, because that's because of racism and classism and patriarchy. And so to be creatives, my creative network is about 50-50 queer folks and heterosexual folks. So if I'm going to be a creative in a community, these folks need to be able to talk about all my intersections. You have to be able to struggle with racism as much as we struggle with anti-queerness. And I have been in spaces with white people who would rather talk about racism than talk about what it means to be anti-queer and anti-women and Black feminism. They will talk to you about racism every day. But when you add the intersections of what I embody, we can't get past that. Those are not anti-racist white people. Those are white people who want to deflect. Well, I come into some of these trainings and I have white people say, well, what about feminism? What about women's rights? Are you talking about white women's rights, or are we talking about trans Black and brown women's rights? Like, what are we talking about? You know, trans women, are we talking about their rights? Are we talking about trans men and how we make up such a large part of the art community, but half of us are left out when it comes to curating, unless we're murdered or dead, or unless someone allows us to be tokenized, and then it can only be one or maybe two, and that's it. And so that's why we're having this training, to begin to have those conversations. But first we have to understand why we're socialized into this. So white people, when I tell you that your whiteness is showing up, you don't deflect back to me. You listen and honor that what I'm telling you to be right and exact, because we worked in a community. We trust each other. When someone white doesn't mean that I'm like, because I hold this space doesn't mean I don't still have so much to learn. And so I want to be in community with folks who I can teach and they can teach me, and we can have an even exchange, because capitalism and racism, it makes everything transactional. And one group of people can get something, but a whole other group of people can't get anything back on the end of that. And we're looking to thwart and undo all of that. And I just said a lot, so I apologize. But,
I love it. I love all of this. Yes, thank you. So with the remaining time we have, I want to know from each of you as creatives, and as women coming from different backgrounds, how folks can be carrying this. And I also mean this specifically, how can white folks be carrying this and making sure that there is space for Black joy? Because Ala, you said, I'm tired. I can't keep showing up to your actions. I can't keep diffusing this if it goes south. You are one person. And you are one person in a group of 5 amazing women running Black Lives Matter New Haven. And it's not fair to you to say we expect everything to be on the shoulders of these women. So what can folks do to make sure there is also room for joy and for liberation and for rest as a form of resistance?
Make sure that what you identify as rest and joy and liberation is what you identify as rest and joy and liberation, and not what people tell you should identify as rest and joy and liberation. For creatives, most of my creative friends are insomniacs, and they're most powerful between 12 o'clock at night and 4 to 7 o'clock in the morning. And supremacy in the world would tell us that that's not restful and that's not right. And so we have to first identify what we deem is our liberation. And I encourage everyone, and I'll give a snippet of what's going to happen in our workshop, is we develop our last session was we work and develop our own self-mission statement. And as creatives, I'm going to push folks to they have to self-identify how they're going to use their creativity in their mission statement. So my mission statement is to be and remain anti-racist. No, that's placating yourself, lying to yourself. How are you? And it may just be, I'm going to doodle and draw every day how I feel around becoming an it can be whatever folks decided to be: writing, singing, making songs, making their own documentary. Constantly thinking and identifying who you are, and internally investigating what you think joy is and where you got that information from, and listening to music and being ratchet and cooking out on the grill and reading the books and doing whatever it is that allows you to find peace, and working so hard to step out of the imposter syndrome that we all have been faced into. And it came up a little bit as the stuff where we're talking about how we have to undo timelines and things like that. And when we're not doing it, it's like, oh my God, the thing's not right. I'm not resting right. I didn't take a nap today. I'm not doing it. I'm not laughing. I didn't sing today. I'm not being joyful. So yes, identify what you think is joy. And love on that, and love on yourself, and tell yourself you love yourself every day. Figure everything else out. Trust the process.
And I'm so sorry I think we're almost out of time. But I love you all so much. Sarah and Lucy, I would love to hear really quickly, although we may get cut off, and that's okay. The magic of Zoom.
I mean, I almost feel that like people can, they can do the work themselves too. Not rely so much on their Black and brown sisters and brothers to kind of be doing that work, but we can educate ourselves. Read the book, acknowledge your privilege, use that privilege and turn it into action. To protect those that are leading those movements so they can rest. So that's something I think it will be really important to try to do.
I just want to reiterate both what Lucy and Al was saying. We make our own meaning. And if, you find meaning in your field, then you should work to make it look like what brings you joy. So do that work. Be honest in that way.
I want to thank you all so much. You've made my heart feel very full at a time when sometimes it doesn't. So thank you. Thank you to Harry. He is the man behind all of the controls, and we couldn't do this without him. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Mwah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Manifestation.
Ala, have an amazing vacation.
I am.
I'm so excited for you.
Me too. Love y'all.
I love you.